There are three kinds of silence: the silence of an empty house, the silence of a marriage that has run out of words, and the silence of a snowstorm so deep and total it feels like the world has been erased. Carol Stratton knew all three. At 56, she had survived a 28-year marriage, the death of a husband she wasn't sure she'd ever truly known, and 2 decades in courtrooms where she'd learned that the truth was almost always the last thing anyone wanted to hear. She had come to the mountain cabin to be alone. What she got instead was a knock at the door. And the man standing in the storm that night, wet, bloodied, asking for nothing more than to come inside, would unravel every assumption she had left. By the time it was over, Carol would understand 3 things: that secrets don't die when people do, that danger doesn't always announce itself, and that some of the most important choices in a woman's life happen not in courtrooms, not in wedding chapels, but in the space between opening a door and closing it. The cabin had belonged to Edward for 31 years before it belonged to her. That's how Carol thought of it even now, 8 months after the funeral. His mountain, his retreat, his carefully curated escape from the life they'd built together in Asheville. The brick house, the law practice, the appearances at charity galas where Edward always knew exactly who to talk to, and Carol had learned to smile without meaning it. She hadn't planned to come in December. The original plan had been spring. Scatter his ashes in the creek behind the cabin, the way his will had specified in that precise, controlled handwriting she had loved once and later learned to fear. Do it quietly, say the words, drive back down the mountain, and begin the rest of her life. But October had come and gone, and November, and Carol had found herself unable to move. Not with grief exactly, with something more complicated, something she didn't have a name for yet. The morning she finally threw her bag in the car and drove north, the weather forecast had been mild, cold but manageable. A possible dusting of snow by Thursday, the meteorologist said with that cheerful confidence that weather people always have right up until the moment they're catastrophically wrong. She arrived on a Tuesday. By Wednesday evening, the sky had turned the color of old pewter. By Thursday morning, she couldn't see the tree line. The generator was running. She had food for a week. Her phone had 3 bars of service, which was better than most visits. She had a stack of Edward's legal files she'd brought to sort through, the last administrative task before she could formally close the estate, and a bottle of wine she'd opened 2 nights ago and hadn't finished. She was fine. She told herself that approximately 40 times a day. At 9:47 p.m. on Thursday, the knock came. Carol set down the file she'd been reading, a real estate transaction from 2019 she hadn't been able to make sense of, and stood very still. The cabin was remote, 22 miles from the nearest town. The private road that led to it was unmarked, unpaved, and invisible under 3 feet of snow. No one knocked on this door. Not in winter, not ever. She moved to the window before she moved to the door, a habit from years of working cases that had occasionally generated threats, and pressed close to the glass. A man, standing in the drift up to his knees, wearing a dark jacket insufficient for the cold. No at-dat. One hand braced against the porch post, not standing the way someone stood when they intended harm, standing the way someone stood when they were trying not to fall. She could see the blood from the window, a cut above his left temple, dark against his pale face, his breath coming in clouds, his other hand pressing something against his ribs. A wound, or the memory of one. She made 3 fast calculations the way she always had. The storm was unsurvivable if he was left outside. The nearest road was impassable by any car, and he was half her weight and bleeding. She opened the door. "Come in," she said. And that was the beginning. Here's what Carol would think about later, in the long, careful months of reviewing everything she knew and everything she'd missed. She had defended guilty people her entire career. She had stood beside men and women who had done terrible things and argued successfully that the system should show them mercy. She understood the difference between guilt and culpability, between what people did and why they did it. She understood that good people could make catastrophic choices. What she hadn't understood yet, not that night, was that sometimes the catastrophic choices had already been made by someone else, and you were simply inheriting them. But that understanding was still 48 hours away. For now, there was a man on her threshold, and the storm was inside the house. His name, he said, was Daniel Farrow. He said it simply, the way people say names when they've practiced saying them simply. Carol had cross-examined enough witnesses to notice the micro-pause before the introduction, the slight reset of his eyes before meeting hers. She filed it without comment. He was 44 or close to it. Dark hair gone silver at the temples, a jaw that suggested a stubbornness he'd learned to disguise. His hands, when she wrapped them around the mug of tea she'd made without asking, were the hands of someone who worked with them. Not calloused in the way of someone doing hard labor, but worn in the way of someone who moved a lot, carried things, stayed ready. He'd been hiking, he said, which was a story she didn't believe for a single moment but accepted without comment. The cut on his temple required 4 strips of medical tape and had stopped bleeding by the time she'd finished cleaning it. There was something at his ribs that wasn't a wound but was a bruise, deep purple and recent, the width of a boot heel, that he didn't mention and she didn't ask about. She gave him the guest room. She locked her own door. She did not sleep. The files from Edward's estate sat on the kitchen table where she'd left them, and sometime around 3 a.m. Carol found herself back at them, not because she particularly wanted to review a decade of property transactions, but because her mind needed something to do that wasn't cataloging every sound from the guest room. Daniel slept, or was quiet, until nearly noon. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, he'd found the first aid kit she'd left on the bathroom shelf and changed the tape on his temple. He'd also, she noticed, changed position, standing with his back to the wall, and a clear line of sight to both the front door and the kitchen window, automatically, without thinking about it. "You're not a hiker," she said, not unkindly. He looked at her for a moment, then something in his shoulders released, almost imperceptibly. "No," he said, "I'm not." She put the coffee on and didn't ask anything else. It was a skill she'd developed over decades, the capacity to leave space for people to fill. Most people couldn't tolerate silence. They rushed into it with explanations, justifications, things they shouldn't say. In her experience, the truth emerged not when you demanded it, but when you simply stopped making it easy to avoid. Daniel lasted 4 minutes. "I don't want you involved," he said. "You're in my cabin," she said. "That ship has sailed." The snow outside was still falling. The road was impassable. The radio, she'd tried it twice that morning, confirmed what the window already told her. They were not going anywhere for at least 2 days. 2 days. 56 years old, she thought. A retired attorney, alone in the mountains with a man she didn't know, whose first name was probably real, but whose last name she'd stake her career on was not. She poured 2 cups of coffee. "You can tell me what you want to tell me," she said. "And what you don't want to tell me, I'll figure out eventually anyway. Your call." Daniel picked up the coffee, looked at her over the rim for a long moment with an expression she didn't have a category for. "Who are you?" he asked. "Someone who's spent 30 years figuring out when people are lying," she said. "Somebody who's not supposed to be here right now," he said. "Neither am I," she said. The fire crackled. Outside, the storm continued its patient erasure of the world. By evening, they'd fallen into a rhythm that Carol would later struggle to explain. The comfortable shared silences of people who are both accustomed to their own company, punctuated by conversations that skipped the usual social scaffolding and went somewhere more direct. He asked about her work without asking her about her marriage, which she appreciated. She asked about his background and accepted the partial answers he gave with more grace than she typically showed her clients. He laughed at something she said about a particularly baffling jury verdict, and the laugh was real and surprised her. She was 56 years old, and she had not felt this particular feeling in a very long time. She recognized it. She wasn't sure that recognition helped. "Let's talk about something. Because here's what nobody tells you when you're 56 and you've been married most of your adult life and you've been widowed, and you're standing in your kitchen at 9 p.m. across from a man whose last name is probably fictional. Your body doesn't ask permission. Your body doesn't consult your grief timeline or your better judgment or the part of your brain that has read extensively about trauma bonding and crisis-induced intimacy and all the very sensible reasons why this was not the right time or the right person or the right anything. Your body just remembers." And what Carol Stratton remembered, standing at the kitchen counter while Daniel watched, the storm through this window with that particular stillness of someone who has learned to be still, was something she'd stopped believing she was allowed to want. She did not act on it, but she stopped pretending, at least to herself, that it wasn't there. The morning of the second day, Carol returned to Edward's files. She'd been avoiding the 2019 real estate folder because something about it nagged her in ways she hadn't wanted to examine. As a defense attorney, she'd learned to trust that particular feeling, The sense that a document was hiding something in plain sight, the way a lie hides inside a technically true sentence. Edward had been an estate attorney. Conservative, meticulous, almost old-fashioned in his precision. His files were models of clarity, which was why this folder bothered her. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't obviously wrong. It was simply opaque in a way nothing else in his practice had been. A series of property purchases through an LLC, though she didn't recognize. A name, Faro Holdings, that meant nothing to her. Transfer documents for land parcels in 3 counties, a financial routing number she couldn't trace to any bank she knew. She was staring at the routing number when Daniel came in from the porch, stamping snow from his boots, carrying 2 split logs from the woodpile. He set the logs down. He looked at the folder on the table. And she watched, because she was very good at watching people, the exact moment his expression changed. It wasn't a dramatic change. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was something quieter than guilt. The expression of a man who has been running from a particular truth and has just turned a corner and found it waiting. Faro Holdings, she said. He didn't answer. You want to sit down, she said. It wasn't a question. He sat. What came out over the next 2 hours was not, she would later think, everything. But it was enough to begin to understand the shape of what she'd been living beside without seeing. Daniel was not his legal name. He was a federal witness. He had been in protective custody for 11 months in connection with a money laundering investigation that stretched across 7 states and involved a network of estate attorneys, small practices, careful men, trusted professionals, who had been moving money through property transactions for a group of people whose names Carol would only learn much later. Edward's name was not on any indictment, but his routing number was in Daniel's file. I didn't know he was involved, Daniel said, and his voice carried the particular weight of a man who is saying something true that he knows will cause damage. I only found out 3 months ago. I was trying to determine the extent before the trial. Carol sat very still. 31 years. She had built a marriage and a life and a career defending people in a system she believed in. She had stood beside a man at charity galas and believed she knew the shape of his choices even when she couldn't always read his silences. How much? She asked. We're still calculating, he began. Don't do that, she said. I'm not a witness. I'm not a victim in your case. How much? He told her. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the snow for a long time. Here's what grief is at its most essential. It's not the loss of the person. It's the loss of the story. The story you told yourself about who they were, who you were together, what it all meant. The story that organized 30 years of ordinary mornings and difficult evenings and compromises that seemed worth it because you trusted the person you were making them for. Carol had already been grieving the loss of Edward. Now she was grieving something harder. She was grieving the version of herself who had not known. Because here's the thing about defense attorneys. The thing that made Carol very good and also made this very particular kind of betrayal cut very deep. She knew, better than almost anyone, that not knowing is not the same as innocent. And the question she would ask herself for many months was not, did Edward do this, but should I have seen it? She was still at the window when Daniel said quietly, It's not your fault. Don't, she said. You don't know enough about me to say that. He was quiet for a moment. Then, no, you're right, I don't. Something about that, the honesty of it, the lack of easy comfort, made it easier to breathe. They came on the evening of the second day. Not a knock this time. A vehicle, too large, moving too fast for the conditions, lights cutting through the storm from the private road she'd assumed was impassable. Daniel heard it first. He was up from the table before she'd registered the sound, moving to the window with that particular controlled speed she'd noticed in him and now understood differently. Get your phone, he said. I have it. Is there another way out of this cabin? Back door, through the kitchen, into the woods. 40 yards to the creek. There's a fire road on the other side. He looked at her with something she didn't have a word for. Admiration, maybe, mixed with regret. You should go, he said. This is my cabin, she said. Carol. I'm a retired criminal defense attorney, she said in her courtroom voice, the one that had steadied dozens of frightened clients in the worst moments of their lives. And those are whoever your handlers were before you went rogue. And I have on this table documentation that is currently of extremely high evidentiary value to at least one federal prosecution. So before you tell me again to go, you should consider whether leaving was actually your best option here. He stared at her. I have 3 bars, she said. Who do I call? What followed was not elegant. It was not the way Carol would have structured it, given the choice. There were two men from the vehicles, and usually not law enforcement. She clocked that immediately by the way they moved and what they weren't wearing. And a conversation through the cabin door that she conducted while Daniel stayed back, and she used the phone in her 30 years of knowing exactly which words created records and which ones didn't. She got the call out. She bought 45 minutes by being very good at one of the things she was best at, talking. 45 minutes was enough. The federal agents who arrived were cold, professional, and deeply unhappy about the circumstances. There were jurisdictional conversations she didn't follow entirely. There was a moment when a young agent looked at the files on the kitchen table and his expression shifted in a way that told her the routing number was already in their system. Daniel was taken into custody, protocol, his handler explained, not arrest. He would be processed and relocated within 48 hours. He was escorted past her in the kitchen doorway. He stopped. The handler gave him 2 seconds, no more. "You already knew," he said to her, "about Edward, not the specifics, but that something was wrong." It wasn't a question. She appreciated that. "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you?" "Because I didn't have proof," she said. "And because I'm an attorney. And because he was my husband." She paused. "And because sometimes you choose the story over the truth, for as long as you can." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, "for opening the door." "Don't thank me," she said. "I would have done the same for anyone." They both knew that wasn't entirely true. Here is the part that doesn't get talked about. Not in the news coverage that followed, and there was coverage carefully worded, names protected, a story about a federal witness and a network of estate attorneys that occupied 3 paragraphs in a regional newspaper and 17 minutes of a national financial crime podcast 3 months later. Not in the conversations Carol had with Edward's former partners, most of whom were as genuinely shocked as she was. Not even in the conversations she had with herself. In the long, quiet evenings after she'd returned to Asheville and begun the work of figuring out what the rest of her life actually looked like. The part that doesn't get talked about is this. She was glad she'd opened the door. Not because it led to justice, though it did. Not because Edward's involvement was eventually confirmed and the appropriate records corrected, though they were. She was glad because of what the 48 hours had given back to her. Not Daniel Farrow, or whatever his name was. She was 56 and she knew the difference between a story and a future. But herself. The woman who stood in a cabin doorway during a storm and made a fast calculation and opened the door. The woman who sat across from a stranger for 2 days and felt, for the first time in a very long time, completely present. The woman who had, in a kitchen under pressure, been exactly who she'd spent a career learning to be. Carol Stratton had spent 8 months wondering who she was without the story of her marriage. In a blizzard, holding a phone, buying time for a man she'd known for 48 hours so she found out. The estate took 8 months to fully resolve. Edward's involvement was classified as cooperative, a legal distinction meaning he had not been a primary architect of the scheme but had facilitated it through negligence that crossed, in the prosecutor's view, into knowing assistance. The language was precise and honest, which Carol appreciated. She declined to pursue civil action against the estate. She donated the cabin, not to a charity, to the county, specifically for use as emergency shelter during extreme weather events. She drafted the donation agreement herself, and she included a provision that the guest room was to be kept perpetually ready. Firewood stacked, medical kit stocked, blankets in the chest at the foot of the bed. Because sometimes, she wrote in the accompanying letter, the most important thing a structure can do is be available when someone needs to come in from the cold. She did not hear from Daniel directly. She hadn't expected to. He was in a program, relocated, and the clean break was probably better for both of them. But 3 months after the trial concluded, she received, through channels she could tell were deliberately circuitous, a single photograph. No note, no return address. The photograph was of a mountain, not hers. Somewhere further north, snow-peaked, vast, beautiful in the particular way of things that are too large for any single human story to contain. She put it on her desk. She went back to work, not defense this time. She opened a practice focused on wrongful conviction cases, the kind of work that required everything she knew about the space between guilt and responsibility, about the truths that hide inside technically accurate sentences, about the patience required to wait for people to fill silences they don't know they're filling. She was good at it. She was, she decided, exactly the right age for it, 56, with the wreckage of one story behind her and something else, uncharted, undetermined, entirely hers, still ahead. You know what the thing is about second acts? They're not about recovering what you lost. They're not about going back to who you were before the thing happened that changed everything. They're not about finding the right person or the right circumstances or the perfect moment when the story becomes what you always hoped it would be. Second acts are about the door, whether you open it, whether you stand in the cold and choose the unknown over the safe, familiar dark of staying inside. Carol Stratton stood at 56 in a blizzard with a stranger on her porch and made a choice that cost her the last comfortable version of her life. And she would tell you, has told me in so many ways, that it was the first free choice she'd made in decades. Because here's the truth that this story holds, if you'll let it. You are not too old for the story to change. You are not too far into your life for the next chapter to be the one that finally, honestly, belongs to you. The storm is already here. The question is just whether you open the door. If this story stayed with you, if something in it felt familiar or hopeful or like something you needed to hear today, I want you to tell me in the comments what part of Carol's story spoke to you. And if you're new here, we tell stories like this every week. Real stories, complicated stories, stories about people who were underestimated and found their strength, people who loved in the wrong direction and found their way, people who were 50 or 60 or 70 and still had something important left to discover. It's never too late. Subscribe, because your second act is waiting. This is Second Acts, and we'll see you in the next one.